Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody coming out here on a Saturday morning. I know that's not the easiest time to get up early. I had planned on giving a very different talk, but then during the pre-conference, when we were discussing the goals that we all wanted to see over the next 5 years for, say, a sort of 2022 conference where we could assess how much we've achieved, there was a lot of discussion about stigma and a lot of discussion about culture and barriers to care. And so I thought, well, I'll just totally redo my talk and I'll talk about stigma. So that's what I'm gonna talk about today. And I'm an anthropologist, so I don't have a lot of hard data to present, no statistics, no need for slides. And I'm going to talk about two things. So first one is, what do we mean when we talk about stigma? And the second is, what do we mean when we talk about culture as a barrier to care? Is stigma a universal category? Is it a valid comparative category? When we talk about stigma of mental illness in Washington, D.C., are we talking about the same thing as when we talk about stigma of mental illness in a very different location? Second, what do we mean when we talk about culture and barriers to care? Culture in the discussions that we had in the pre-conference tended to be defined as what other people do, and not what we all do. And I think it will be hard to achieve our goals to help people with autism if we work against other cultures and only for our own. So I have three perspectives that I bring to this presentation, three authorial perspectives. The first one is that I am a descendant of shrinks. So my father was a psychiatrist and analyst. My grandfather was a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. My great-grandfather was a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. In fact, I actually wrote here, pause for sounds of pity and compassion, just in case you felt sorry for me. And my family, of course, wanted me to be the fourth-generation analyst. And in 1968, when I was 7 years old, my grandfather gave me a book called The Borderline Syndrome, in which he wrote, "To the future fourth-generation Grinker psychoanalyst." So I was a great disappointment. The second authorial perspective is as an anthropologist, and I've tried to travel as much as I can. I claim no special knowledge, but I have worked in South Korea and South Africa, India, East Coast of the United States, and though I wasn't really knowledgeable about autism at the time, a long time ago I also worked in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and that did involve looking at health illness. And the third authorial perspective is as the father of the marvelous Isabel Grinker, who's a 25-year-old young woman who proudly calls herself autistic, and her pride comes from her differences and not her ability to conform. So let me begin with the first authorial perspective. So it's midsummer 1933, Vienna. And a young man, my grandfather, also named Roy Richard Grinker, finds a double apartment over a butcher shop at 19 Bergasse, a short walk from the Danube Canal. Inside, there is a doctor's waiting room, and it smells of cigars and wet dogs, and it's littered with old magazines. He waited for the previous patient to leave, but none did. He would soon learn that patients walked through one door into the office and exited the office through a different door. This was by design, so that patients would never meet. And he found it curious. I mean, if you were in a urologist's office or a cardiologist's office, you'd sit in the same waiting room together with other patients. Why not in a psychoanalyst's office? The question was partly resolved some weeks later when a distraught woman opened the wrong door and ran through the waiting room crying. The doctor, Sigmund Freud, apologized to my grandfather for the scene, and he said, "You should have seen her before she started therapy." The more reasonable explanation for the two doors, the stigma and shame of seeing a psychiatrist or psychoanalyst, would dawn on him only later. My grandfather was born in 1900, just a year after the Interpretation of Dreams was published. In that and other works, Freud proposed what I would consider to be his two great truths. The first, that modern civilization constrains many of our essential impulses, and second, that we are all neurotic, that we all have some form of mental illness, though on a spectrum. A mental illness for Freud was really a matter of degree more than a category of whether you fit into this or that category. He believed that if there was a basic foundation to all humanity, it was instinct, the dark, the primitive forces that lie behind reason and rationality. And these forces were the seeds of both creativity and achievement, and yet modern society had both benefited from them and suppressed them. Through psychoanalysis, Freud wanted to show the world that what we believed was progress, systems of law and order, morality, science, economic structures, was in fact a sickness and the source of civilization's discontent. This perspective affected my own understandings of illness. Growing up in a family infused with psychological thought, I listened as my grandfather insisted that mental illnesses were actually expected responses to external stressors. Remember, this is the time of the DSM-2, where everything is a reaction. My parents and their friends talked about sex and aggression like they were talking about the last night's weather or baseball game. I listened to conversations about highly charged ideas I was old enough to be deeply affected by, but too young to understand. Yet I also grew up believing that emotional pain was a normal part of life, and that mental illnesses existed within a hierarchy of all diseases. Anxiety, for example, was more serious than the common cold, and less serious than cancers, but still in the range of what typical human beings confronted throughout their lives. When I was growing up, mental illnesses, including autism, were talked about in a whisper. But I still wasn't aware until later of the difference between a mental illness and a physical illness. People also whispered about cancer. They whispered about dementia, sexually transmitted diseases. They whispered about people who were divorcing. They whispered about people who didn't marry. In the 10th grade, I got a weekend job on the psychiatric ward of a hospital, doing what a 10th grader can do, filing, cleaning. And one day I bumped into a classmate who was on the ward. All hell broke loose. A huge number of people mobilized. Her parents, my parents, her doctors, the principal of the school, my supervisor at work, and I was so harshly admonished to keep what I had seen confidential, that I had seen this girl, in this psychiatric ward, that I felt as if I had committed a crime just by laying eyes on her. And I kind of trace my knowledge about stigma and mental illness to that time, which was traumatic for, I guess, many people, including me. And then the next date that I see as sort of the onset of thinking about stigma was 1994, when my daughter Isabel was diagnosed with autism at the age of 2. We engaged in a continuous battle to find appropriate education for her. After she was dragged down a hallway by a school administrator for making sounds during an assembly, we documented her scratches and bruises. We wrote applications for her to enroll in independent schools. The school specializing in autism said she was too high functioning. The school specializing in learning disabilities said she was too low functioning. Outside of school, she was denied access to art, dance, and sports classes. She was not invited to children's birthday parties. On one occasion, a mother at a summer camp threatened to pull her daughter from the program because she didn't want her daughter near mine, and she eventually did withdraw the child. At a PTA meeting to discuss the inclusion of children with disabilities at our local elementary school, a father voiced serious and angry concern that the school would not tell him enough about how the children with disabilities in the school might negatively affect his own typically developing child. So I've traveled as much as I could over the past few decades, and almost everywhere the communities into which autistic people are born today are different from the past. It wasn't so long ago when people were given diagnoses of mental retardation, madness even, childhood schizophrenia, were institutionalized, when restricted interests and social communication impairments were so denigrated, when parents were blamed for their children's problems. But today, you can go to a Starbucks and overhear people talking about their children's doses of this or that and attention drug. You can, if you were in my office, a fly on the wall in my office, you'd hear students telling me about their struggles with anxiety and depression. Lady Gaga and Prince William talk openly about their emotional struggles. She with post-traumatic stress disorder, he with depression. In a post-game interview on national television, after winning the National Basketball Association championship in 2010, Los Angeles Lakers MVP Ron Artest thanked his psychiatrist. We now know that Pope Francis was once in therapy with a psychoanalyst in Argentina. So if the depictions of people with mental illness and autism in current movies and television in the US are any indication, we've made a lot of progress. In fact, autism has not only ceased to be a source of embarrassment, but at least one presentation of autism, I guess you'd call it the nerd or the high-tech expert, has become cool. Other disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, have not fared as well. Alcoholics Anonymous still has to be anonymous. Mental illnesses continue to be so stigmatized that psychiatrists and psychoanalysts will do almost anything to avoid frightening people away from treatment. The very phrase mental health is designed to avoid the connotations of sickness. Even the National Institute of Mental Health does not call itself an institute of mental illness, even though the other institutes are named for diseases, like the National Cancer Institute or the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Post-traumatic stress disorder, despite how common it is, remains shameful for many people, especially in the military. We may have relegated to history most of the horrors associated with mental illness, diagnosis, and hospitalization, but some of the processes that caused them are still with us. If you go to Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles today, you'll see that the Church of Scientology has a museum. It's called Psychiatry, an Industry of Death, and it's free, no ticket charge. Despite media accounts that warn of epidemics of attention deficit disorder, autism, bipolar disorder, among others, mental illnesses are still stigmatized, undertreated, and underreported. More than 25% of American adults suffer from a mental illness at any point in time, and during their lifetime, the majority of Americans will have at least one mental illness. Yet 60% of people with a mental illness receive no treatment at all, and mental illnesses remain the leading cause of disability in the US. And lack of treatment is significantly worse outside of North America and Western Europe. Every year, mental illness accounts for 12% of the total disease burden worldwide. Answering questions about the origins and future of stigma requires asking some specific questions, like why does one society discriminate against somebody that another society accepts? How in the same society do people stigmatize something now that was once accepted, like smoking in the US, or accept something that was once stigmatized, like homosexuality in the US? What can industrialized societies in Europe and North America learn from non-Western societies to improve the care and treatment of people with stigmatizing conditions? And conversely, how can the recent history of autism, at least in Western Europe and North America, help reduce the stigma associated with autism in low and middle income countries? Despite their best efforts, clinicians know that people with mental illnesses suffer from two illnesses. First, the condition itself, and second, the discomfort or shame that comes from society's judgments, the process often called stigma. It's a discrediting social label, a mark of disgrace that can lead to exclusion and isolation. It's when your psychological or physical state defines your identity, when people see you as flawed and incompetent, when you are invisible to others, when people see your suffering but blame you for it. Stigma is what happens to someone who transgresses the bounds of what a society considers to be normal. For decades in the US, a diagnosis of autism in a child was also tantamount to a diagnosis of the parent, a charge of parental malpractice. In Seoul, South Korea, Koreans have understood autism to be hereditary and therefore a reflection of the quality of a state or status of the family. The labels we use affect us. They affect all disabilities, even physical ones. witnessed some of the studies of people who enter into a school for the blind, and once they're classified as blind, they stop using the residual vision they have, or go into a school for the deaf, and once they're labeled deaf, stop using the residual hearing they have. Labels matter because labels have consequences. Stigma continues to hold a privileged place in the lexicon of psychology. Remarkably, though there have been hundreds and hundreds, maybe more than 1,000 articles over the past few decades on stigma, the concept remains relatively unexamined in specific cultural and social contexts and is an integral part of our vocabulary. And despite the fact that stigma is by no means stable or universal, and the meanings of mental illness vary across the world, stigma has never been a focus of much anthropological research. Unfortunately, this concept of stigma, the one we heard so much about during the pre-conference, can be like a black hole. It's an entity that absorbs all the particulars of human experience from which nothing escapes. The concept is treated as if it's an objective fact like water or air. And then the questions of why one person is valued, why another one is shamed, why one society embraces human differences, another society abhors, have little meaning. Yet stigma continues to be a concept to which the problems of prevention and treatment of mental illness are often reduced. And once we explain barriers to psychiatric care simply as stigma, the conversation stops. What we need to do is to go beneath the surface to figure out in context how to ameliorate the diverse phenomena to which that concept refers. We talk about stigma in societies everywhere, but most languages have no word for it. So what if we, using English, talked about stigma, but we couldn't use the word stigma? How would we then talk about it? We couldn't use that word. We would necessarily have to confront the specific mechanisms of social branding and exclusion. We would have to confront the realities and the particulars of human experience. Stigma is a cultural process. There's nothing natural about excluding anybody with any particular characteristic. Certainly not natural to view human differences as pathology. It's not natural to see homosexuality as an illness, though the American Psychiatric Association considered it one until 1973. It's not natural to see psychoses or all psychoses as pathology. American Indian groups believe that one should hear the voices of the dead after a loved one has died. It's a sign of close familial attachment. It's certainly not natural for Hansen's disease, or leprosy, one of the least contagious of all human diseases, to evoke so much horror in society. It's not natural for members of the same nuclear family in Brazil to occupy lower or higher statuses within that same family according to their skin color and hair texture. These are certain characteristics that each society develops and which you have to learn. They're not embedded in nature. It's not natural to see deafness as a disability. In a poignant example of the lack of stigma, for more than 300 years on the American island of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, residents experienced an extraordinarily high incidence of hereditary deafness. So much so that by the early 1900s, everyone on the island knew sign language. Deafness was not a disability, but a normal part of humanity. And it in no way marked anyone as inferior or incapable. And during the 21st century, when researchers interviewed elderly people about that time in the past when there was so much deafness, the interviewees couldn't even remember who was deaf and who was not, because that wasn't a distinction that meant anything to them. And it's not natural for autism to be disabling and stigmatizing. I spent the month of May in Namibia, much of it in the east, with the Junkwasi, the hunter-gatherers, and I met a 9-year-old boy named Eshe. And Eshe repeatedly makes the sound th. He's nonverbal. He drools. He moves his fingers in unusual ways in front of his face. He makes poor eye contact and likes to be alone. There's a ratty suitcase in the village that the little boys and girls like to play on and pretend they're riding on some sort of animal. He likes the zipper, and he moves it back and forth. He appeared to me to be classically autistic, but his parents have never taken him to a clinic. And they and others in his village spoke warmly about him. His father told me, he's not sick. Why should we take him to a doctor if he's not sick? He's great at herding the goats. He always knows where they are at any time of the day. So you could, from one perspective, say, look, here's this kid who's isolating himself all the time, just staying with the goats, and he's not playing with other kids. Or you could say, look at how useful this boy is, how he's happy with these goats, and he's taking care of them, and he's helping everybody. His father also said that Eshe has a great memory, that he can find anything that anybody's lost in the bush, a knife, an arrow, or something. Now, he gets teased and he gets bullied, but people also look out for him. And when I asked his father if he was afraid of who would take care of Eshe when he and his wife passed away, he looked confused and put his arms up, and he said, we can't all die. There's a community there. Eshe's father's optimism about the future for his son stems from the kind of society in which he lives, a society in which there are multiple caretakers. What if in the United States, or perhaps in whatever country you come from, we could rethink our expectations about our children living independently in that bizarre thing called nuclear households? The impact on my own life has been clear. I spend more time than ever trying to reinforce relationships with extended family, because I know that that is the thing that is going to be crucial for my daughter in the future. In the pre-conference stakeholders meeting, we heard the word stigma repeatedly, and some participants, especially those working in sub-Saharan Africa, said that stigma was a barrier to care. And I heard someone say that rituals associated with witchcraft and sorcery are inhumane. But the people that I've lived with in a variety of places, Central Africa, Swaziland, told me that my society was the cruel one, binding children's teeth in metal wires, circumcising babies. You should at least wait till they're 15. So I guess I'd like to challenge the idea that we have to work against culture in service of promoting our culture. So here's what we need to remember. First of all, everyone in the world uses multiple healthcare systems. Some of the most rigorous scientists in the world go to chiropractors, use herbal medicines, do acupuncture. Why shouldn't Zulu mothers visit traditional healers? Who are we to say what's right and wrong? Second, local beliefs and practices do not exist without some reason and probably would not persist if they didn't serve some function. Third, I wonder if we're fighting a losing battle when it comes to trying to persuade people that autism is idiopathic. I mean, the concepts of luck and chance are not universal, and people will seek explanations, especially if they think that scientists who they place so much trust in cannot provide them. Just think of the anti-vaccine movement in the United States, in which there was this explanation that had to come because the scientists, their explanations were too complicated. But what if local beliefs about causality and care are not so much a challenge for intervention, but actually provide an opportunity? Stigma is a form of social suffering, and so it requires a social cure. And to suggest otherwise can create resistance to the delivery of the care the professional wants to provide. When I was working in the Ituri forest in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there were 5 cases of marriage-related sorcery. Marriage-related sorcery. So what happened was that there were charges of sorcery that had been preceded by interpersonal conflict between a husband and wife. And one of the cases reported to me, I witnessed 4 out of the 5. One reported to me was of a child named Utimuka, and his seizures were the manifestation of the discord between the parents. And I'll say more about this in a second. But in all 5 of these cases of marriage-related sorcery, the initial discord was pushed aside after the seizures began. Instead, people now focused on the conflict between the victim and the sorcerer. In other words, the community managed the problem of marital conflict by shifting attention to a new problem. With the exception of one case in which a man refused to pay a debt to his brother, all the convulsions followed the same pattern. First, a series of arguments between spouses. Second, the onset of seizures in someone in the family. Third, the statement of the name of the sorcerer by the person having the seizure, or at least people said they heard it. Fourth, the accusation that the sorcerer's actions were motivated by sexual rivalry. And fifth, the sympathetic response of the community to the victim. Sixth, the replacement of the original argument between husband and wife with a new one between sorcerer and family. The belief in supernatural malevolence from the outside functioned to keep the family together. It kept the community together. It reinvigorated the ties, cemented the ties between the people within the family. Utimuka began having seizures when I estimate he was about 3 years old. Some of the people who witnessed his seizures reported that during the seizures, he said the name of a man who had unsuccessfully propositioned his mother for sex. This was sorcery, voluntary malevolence from outside the lineage, and so the community rallied around the child and his parents as innocent victims. Other people said they didn't hear the name, and it was probably the ancestors who were displeased for some reason, and that the child's condition was just a manifestation of a sickness in the group. In either case, it was the group that took responsibility for caring for the child or the spouses. It was the group that was already there, prepared to mobilize as social support. And one of the things we do know is that if anything helps outcomes with people with a variety of conditions, mental illnesses in particular, it's social support. So this tendency to focus on the group care of the individual provides an opportunity rather than a challenge. Rather than dismiss local beliefs, we might emphasize that there are some remedies or interventions the community can provide in addition to taking action against, say, a sorcerer or praying. Can we leverage this tendency to provide the kinds of social supports that the evidence-based therapies call for? Anthropologist Jason Throop has shown that among the Yap in Micronesia, people interpret emotional suffering positively as a relational experience that cements kinship ties. And so they're in a constant struggle now with medical professionals who tell them that their suffering is not social, but personal. In Brazil, anthropologist João Biel has shown that people with certain neurodegenerative diseases that have psychiatric complications seek to build their own narratives of disability, but then lose that agency to narrate their own suffering when psychiatric professionals recast that person's suffering in the language of mental illness. So we ought to think about whether or not it always makes sense for us to employ the category of autism. And that's our category. And it's only useful if it drives a service. Imagine there's no service. What's the use of giving that diagnosis? We should ask whether we could do just as well by addressing the various features that we cluster together as autism, but without our category. After all, we may think of autism as a valid and stable category, but who knows how we're going to think about things in 10 years or 20 years. My daughter will have challenges with repetitive behaviors and social communication and language, no matter what we call her. It's so easy to forget that our categories are the categories that we have now, that they're constructions, temporary frameworks that we use to do what we think is best. Think about Asperger's disorder. So it existed, it was a valid category, and now it doesn't exist anymore as a valid category. And it's not because scientists were wrong, or that clinicians were wrong, or that anybody was stupid. It's that we needed that framework at a particular time. We needed a less stigmatizing label for certain kinds of presentations of ASD, and stigma's declined enough, and we know that people can't reliably distinguish between subtypes. We don't need it anymore. But it doesn't mean that that category was ever representing anything real. It was the organizing framework that we used. And that's what we are doing today with ASD. And we just forget at every moment that it's actually a construction. We are constructing these categories. Now, suppose I'm a hunter-gatherer in Namibia. I could come up with a pretty reasonable diagnosis that might work in South Africa. Let's call it vegetarianism, because I know how ambivalent South Africans are about eating meat. I'm sorry, that's rude. Let's call it omnivore dysphoria. That's better. So the essential feature of omnivore dysphoria is distress regarding eating patterns. I wrote this last night, by the way. It was very fun. What'd you say? After dinner, I wrote it. It was very fun. Yeah, so the essential feature of omnivore dysphoria is distress regarding eating patterns. There's a persistent fear of and desire to avoid meat consumption alone and in situations in which the individual's avoidance may be exposed to scrutiny by others, leading to embarrassment and feelings of alienation. Anticipatory anxiety occurs if the individual is confronted with the necessity to consume meat. Impairment may be mild or affect every aspect of life, including phobic avoidance of social situations or activities that involve or symbolize the real or imagined trauma of meat consumption, such as a braai, or the website www.biltong.co.za. Vegetarianism may interfere with the ability to form and sustain interpersonal relationships, and may also lead to social distress at the workplace. The individual experiences these conflicts as irreconcilable aspects of his or her personality, often justifying the position through a rigid ideology, physical mission, or higher purpose. Sounds real enough, doesn't it? No, both Hitler and Ceausescu were vegetarians, but that's beside the point, just in terms of rigid ideology. But I think we need to do more of this sort of thing, where we step outside of our own world, we take a perspective where we think outside the box and think differently about conditions that we might think exist independently of culture. And that includes physical illnesses, bacteria, viruses, genetic mutations. And in order to see this, we have to do what anthropologists call thick description. I'll tell you a little bit about thick description by showing you first what the opposite is, a thin description. So let's say we look at abnormal cells of cancer in a microscope. You can identify HIV with a blood test. You can identify this bacterium under the microscope. But none of these conditions is understandable in any but the most simplistic way if we don't pay attention to what they mean in social life. A technical description is what anthropologists call a thin description. Like if I was to give a knowing wink to a friend and we just describe that as a contraction of the eyelid. It has a lot of cultural meaning, but the technical thin description is just the contraction of the eyelid. It tells us very little. A thick description includes the complex ways in which we experience illness and even provide it with meaning through metaphors, like when AIDS was talked of as a plague, cancer as an evil, leprosy as corruption, autism the loss of the soul or the person. None of those things are visible in a microscope. Now consider a thick description of another physical illness, like a woman who is diagnosed with breast cancer. A woman diagnosed with breast cancer at that moment sees her life change. Her vision of her future may change. Her work life may change. Maybe the relationships she thought were the most stable will change. People that she thought were close friends are anxious about cancer and they kind of get a little distant. And perhaps acquaintances she thought were not very close to her become closer and supportive friends. But at any rate, a social network is mobilized around her that will be different from the one that existed around her prior to her diagnosis. Depending on the society in which she lives, she might think that a malevolent force was at work, or that it was chance, or that there's some sort of genetic mutation that is in her family, and now she worries about her daughter's futures. Even the medical treatment that she seeks will be affected by her culture, whether she sees a pastor at a church, has chemotherapy, surgery, herbal remedies, sees a shaman. If she lives in a society in which the breast is associated with femininity and attractiveness, her sense of being a woman may change. And the experience of disease then, this experience of disease as illness, is not written in the cells of that tumor. So I want to provide a few recommendations based on this kind of overview of how we can think about culture and stigma and the importance of doing more detailed descriptions of illness and culture. First of all, stigma is a moral judgment. It's a moral judgment that requires thick description of the context in which people with disabilities exist. For better or for worse, the moral framework of much of the world today is capitalism. Indeed, mental illnesses were born from capitalism. Over the course of the 18th century, there were two crucial developments related to capitalism and the Enlightenment in Europe, in Western Europe. First was the shift away from lumping together all people who did not work. The impoverished, the physically sick, the insane, the criminal were all lumped together in houses of confinement. In 1 year in the 18th century, 1% of the population of Paris lived in these houses of confinement. Scientists turned, eventually, this lump of people into distinct types. And so the first development was the shift away from lumping together all of these people into new categories, particularly disarticulating the insane from institutions and turning them into the category of patients. Second was the shift away from seeing people as a unified whole on a spectrum to seeing human beings as separate, distinct, and stable types. Remember, it's only by the early 1800s that we get the first anatomical nomenclature for the female reproductive anatomy, because before that time, biologists believed that men and women existed on a continuum of one sex, male. It's only in 1892 that we see the invention of the concept of the homosexual and the heterosexual, because what was happening over the course of the rise of capitalism was the construction of distinct and stable types, both in service of capitalism and in service of science. And so this is the culture in which we professionals, advocates, and parents live. We live in a time now in which the logic of life and the logic of the market have fused. And economic rationality extends into ostensibly non-economic domains so that market values pervade all aspects of life, including the way we think about illnesses. And that includes the development of these stable, distinct categories. As the recent history of autism demonstrates, where a mental illness can be fitted into our society in a way that is economically valuable, the stigma associated with it will decline. The decline of the stigma of autism, for example, is, in my mind at least, associated with the reconfiguration of the disabling features of autism, social awkwardness, communication difficulties, narrow and repetitive interests, into enabling qualities, the reconfiguration of disabling qualities into enabling ones, especially in the high technology economic sector, like in Silicon Valley. Technology like digital media have also helped develop new kinds of sociality for people with autism. Work and productivity are thus one way to decrease social exclusion and increase social interactions, as demonstrated by the example of autism. In contrast, smoking is now highly stigmatized in the United States, though not in many other parts of the world, not only because it's seen as unhealthy, because it separates people from the workplace. It removes them from the majority of everyday social interactions. Capitalism is not the cause of emotional suffering, but capitalism shaped and continues to shape the particular kinds of illness categories and definitions we've created and the particular kinds of judgments we make about them. We should rethink the individualism that is part of capitalism in order to enhance the social supports that contribute to health. Most people in the world live with their families, where they are less likely to be marginalized than if they lived alone or even in nuclear families. This is one reason why the outcomes for people with schizophrenia are often better in rural, non-Western locations than they are in big cities like London or Washington, D.C. Yet many healthcare professionals continue to think that successful treatment outcomes include independent living. Second, if we accept stigma as something which involves alienation from work, we need to find more creative ways to incorporate people with chronic illnesses into productive economic activity, as is happening with autism. Third, we need to stop pretending that mental illnesses are context dependent. Despite increased openness about mental illnesses, many people, like the celebrities Lady Gaga and Prince William, I guess he wouldn't like to hear himself as a celebrity, Prince, royal, continue to promote the idea that mental illnesses are products of events, like assault or the death of a parent. This is not to deny the powerful role of trauma in shaping illness, but most illnesses are neither sudden nor reduced to an event or a single factor. The person with major depression might imagine that his sadness will go away if he wins the lottery or falls in love, but the reality is that mental illnesses are complex with gradual onset and treatment. Justifying a mental illness in terms of something that acts on the individual from outside of the person in which the event rather than the person is culpable, paradoxically reinforces the idea of blame that is so central to stigma, that absent an event that causes a mental illness, the mentally ill person is responsible for his or her own suffering. Fourth, we should seriously consider reducing the number of different mental illness categories that we have, because the proliferation of distinct conditions is associated with stigma. Echoing recent changes in the way that the American Psychiatric Association is conceptualizing mental illness, I feel positively about shifting away from categorical approaches to disease, in which one either has a disease or does not have a disease, toward one that is more dimensional, in which people can have various levels of a condition on a continuum. Researchers have shown that mild symptoms of autism are common in the general population, and that family members of a child with autism often exhibit isolated or subtle autistic traits. With autism, as with many medical diagnoses like hypertension or obesity, the boundary lines are drawn as much by culture as by nature. Dividing up the workings of the mind is never as orderly as categorizing species, and if you're in anthropology, you know that even that is not actually so easy. You have to wonder how we might benefit from a return to the spectrum models of more early capitalism, where concepts like sex and gender and other forms of identity were more fluid. As autism shows, stigma decreases when a condition affects us all, when we all exist on a spectrum with more or less of a certain set of features. This was Freud's great hope, that by showing that we are all neurotic, we might understand we're all afflicted in some way. And perhaps we need, therefore, a new normal, and might be the one that the writer Andrew Solomon describes in his book, Far from the Tree. It's difference, not homogeneity, that unites us. While writing about schizophrenia, dwarfism, deafness, autism, other conditions, Solomon realized something important about himself, that as a gay man with a history of serious depression and suicidality, he was more normal than abnormal. He writes, quote, "The exceptional is ubiquitous," unquote. He continues, quote, "To be entirely typical is the rare and lonely state," unquote. And that perspective might do wonders for breaking down the barriers to care and reducing the shame and the silence that exacerbate human suffering. Now, I'm going to end by just coming back full circle to my grandfather. In 1961, he published a long paper in the Archives of General Psychiatry with the unusual title Homocletes, which was a term that he coined for mentally healthy men. He had done a big protocol of mental illness at a community college in Chicago. And when all of the researchers were done looking at those who had screened positive for various kinds of conditions, he said, well, what about the ones who were healthy? What did they look like? Let's look at the healthy ones. Let's see what they look like. Because we always forget to look at the healthy ones. We screen them out and then we don't look at them. And so he described a group of male community college students in Illinois who had no diagnosable mental diseases. Some of these so-called healthies had unhappiness. They had phobias. They were depressed. Whatever. They all had something. But showed little evidence of distress or disability that would qualify for a mental illness diagnosis. What were they like? They had C averages. They had average IQs of 110. They had some friends. They had girlfriends. They weren't particularly ambitious or creative. Their goals were to have a decent job and a house and be able to eat and watch football. Their goals were not anything that would make anybody turn their head. They were rather compulsive and rigid with narrow interests, and they dealt with dilemmas, emotional or practical, through action, not by thinking about it, but by doing something. I don't know exactly how you would categorize this, but they seem to me a rather boring group of people. And so, noting how much was in the literature about the costs of mental illness, my grandfather wondered, what are the costs of mental health? And so he asked, and I'll just quote his question here from his 1961 archives paper. Are the compulsive character and rigidity, the sharply focused and limited interests, the use of activity to maintain comfort, the absence of creativity, fantasies, and introspection, the costs we have to pay for stability and mental health? I thought that was fascinating in many ways. And it not only sounds like he's might be talking about people who are on the spectrum, but it also sounds like he's saying that perhaps some degree of mental illness is necessary for humanity to remain vibrant, creative, and diverse. I may not have become a psychiatrist and have disappointed my family, but I do have Freud as my cell phone case. So at least I feel I'm doing some justice to my lineage. Thanks so much.